So good evening. The issue on marijuana is actually a lot more complex than people think. There are really two areas you have to look at. The first is, why was it made illegal in the first place? There's a historical and rather interesting story behind it, which has been, as time has gone along, disproved. The second is, what are the benefits of legalizing it now? So we have to start from the very beginning. Now, we call it marijuana, we call it cannabis, we call it ganja. It's actually pretty funny to know that ganja is actually the English name for the herb as it is. Cannabis came into this part of the world from India. It was used primarily by the East Indian laborers, and as time went along, it became more popular with people of a certain social strata. It then went on, and surprisingly, in 1912, at the Opium Conference, which was a conference held by the superpowers of the world back then, to determine what to do with respect to opium, cocaine, and morphine. Marijuana didn't play a part then, but at the end of that conference, it was determined that Indian hemp, as it was termed in 1912 anyway, was to have a certain consideration in how to deal with it as time went along. Now, there's a lot of back and forth on this, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the criminalization of marijuana occurred primarily as a result of economic interests that happened in the United States post the prohibition of alcohol. Marijuana was actually the Mexican name for the drug, and it was used under that name to justify any number of social ills that the United States government, as it were, attempted to justify why it should have been made illegal, and tobacco and alcohol would have been the preferred drug of choice. By the 1930s, marijuana had been made illegal in states, and then through economic pressure on the international scale, this spread to all other countries, including the United Kingdom, by way of its Dangerous Drugs Act in the 1930s, and thereafter to the colonies and other parts. Now, the funny thing is that unlike the other drugs that had been classified as dangerous drugs, which at the time was opium, morphine, cocaine, marijuana had had no medical or any other empirical evidence to suggest that it should be classified as being dangerous. And what do we mean by dangerous? We're speaking dangerous with respect to the medical impact on the person, and dangerous with respect to the social impact that comes from that particular impact. We're talking addiction and addictive tendencies and what flows from that. As time went along, though, the US position softened. We're all aware of the US war on drugs that started in the 70s and proceeded into the 80s. It was in 2002, interestingly enough, at the end of the war on drugs, that it was revealed that the recommendations made back in the 70s when this war started suggested that marijuana should not have been targeted. That for personal use or for small use, it shouldn't have been deemed a dangerous drug. And this came in hand with developments that occurred in the late 80s and early 90s in several states in the US that suggested that medical marijuana was now par for the course. By the year 2000, 16 states in the US had legalized medical marijuana. In fact, some of you may know that in this region, there was a treatment derived from marijuana, I believe it's cannabisol, that was used for treatment of glaucoma. However, that being said, by the year 2000, 16 states in the US had, not decriminalized, but rather legalized medical marijuana. And at this point, major inroads had begun. By the year 2000, in Canada, medical marijuana had also become legal. By 2011 in Uruguay, the movement was on to completely legalize marijuana in that country. And by 2018, after 18 odd years or so of various inroads being made by way of the Canadian Charter, Canada also legalized marijuana. As it stands, as of May 2019, and I'm saying May 2019 to include a recent judgment made in St. Kitts and Nevis, 45 countries have made representations and or have either decriminalized marijuana to a certain extent, legalized it to a certain extent, or entirely made it legal. This doesn't include, by this time, the 40 states in the United States. Now, this movement hasn't been without empirical evidence. In 2016, the World Health Organization drafted a paper on the topic on what were the detriments relative to medical marijuana. And they determined that, save for the, short-term effects, and the short-term effects were quite minimal, the long-term effects were also relatively minimal and mostly concerned with the smoking of marijuana rather than its general use. The general conclusion that they came to was that it did not justify the classification of a dangerous drug, and that, like alcohol and tobacco, it was really only particularly dangerous to those persons who were already susceptible and to adolescents. They doubled down on this on a letter, or rather in a letter, dated 24th of January 2019 to the UN, where they set out that certain treatments involving cannabis and cannabis-related items were, or rather ought not to be considered as dangerous drugs on an international scale. In 2018, the CARICOM Marijuana Commission also issued a report stating very much the same thing. In 2019, the judgment in St. Kitts and Nevis also set out all the history and has been, to a great extent, being used in this jurisdiction to justify the movement into legalizing and decriminalizing marijuana to certain extents. So, historically, and based on modern evidence, there's really no good reason why marijuana should be considered as a dangerous drug as versus any other narcotic in the line of cigarettes or even alcohol. But let's go further. Now, Jamaica in 2015 decriminalized marijuana and legalized it to a certain extent. Before I get there, you may wonder why I switch between the terms. Decriminalization is the process by which certain acts relating to, in this case, marijuana, no longer carry a criminal stigma. That is, it's very similar to a parking ticket. You get caught with it, or whatever the circumstances that's decriminalized, you'll be fined and you'll be sent back out in the streets relative to that. It doesn't count as a criminal offense. Legalization, however, is the removal of this regulatory system and allows even greater use across a greater board. It's perhaps very similar to what occurred with respect to a judgment sometime last year, where, certain sexual acts that were previously illegal was now made legal. So there's a distinction. And Jamaica, despite what some people may believe, actually both decriminalized and legalized marijuana in certain extents. They decriminalized the actual possession of it in certain small amounts, I believe less than 2 ounces, and they, legalized it with respect to legal medical marijuana and its use thereof. Also, the production of up to 5 plants for personal use. They have actually enjoyed several benefits as a result on an economic and social scale. And it's well recognized across all the other jurisdictions that have enjoyed it. One, we're looking at the economic value. Just last year following, it could have been actually this year, just following the legalization of medical marijuana, they exported a large product of CBD-related oils. CBD is a particular compound found in marijuana. Of course, it was to great value to them, and I understand that they intend to do so further. They've enjoyed not only that, but the breaking of the black market and the criminal underworld with respect to marijuana and the ultimate effects of that. They've spent less money on policing, on justice. And ultimately, they've also enjoyed the benefit of, to put it simply, better weed. Because now it's being monitored and, quality and standards are being met. The funny thing is that if one looks at it from even the US perspective, as in Colorado, Colorado actually was one of the first states to legalize recreational use of marijuana, and that state enjoyed, I believe, at the start, a 2% increase in their economic perspective for medical marijuana or marijuana tourism. And in fact, I think a lot of us may be aware of, may have been tempted by, the so-called relaxed attitude in Amsterdam relative to the use of marijuana as well. There is a marked value in legalizing, or at the very least decriminalizing marijuana. Now, moving forward, there's really only one other question left, which is what is the difference between, as it stands, the illegal marijuana as it exists and the legal type. There's something called tetrahydrocannabinol, and that is what creates the high, as it were, in marijuana, the psychoactive compound. THC is what they've been trying to really outlaw. The secondary compound, CBD, right, which is cannabinol, is much more easier to work with. Certainly, the amount of THC in regular marijuana is quite limited, and most of this legislation is designed to not only enhance the CBD use, but also to restrict THC use. Generally, though, when it comes down to cannabis, again, both CBD and THC has their benefits, but realistically, there's no medical evidence to suggest otherwise. Do I support legalization? Yeah, I actually do. I probably would never smoke it, or eat it, or drink it, or use it in a cream, but there's certainly no difficulty to deal with that. So, any particular questions? No? All right. It appears that everyone wants to go home. So, I'll just wrap up there. Unless, 5 seconds. I see. Okay, well, it appears the vast majority of those who've engaged in the poll have agreed that, given the medical reports that I've just described, we should legalize it. Fair enough. And of course, it appears that, 18-1, there's good money in this as well. I don't know if I need to persuade anyone with anything. Unless perhaps the one user wants to say something. No? How about the two from the earlier one? No? All right. Let me leave you for now. Good evening.